Andrew Wolfline is the Chief Strategy Officer at Monix USA and the presiding trustee of the ASKB Military Collection, an organization at Brown University that he has been involved in since 1996. Andrew has lectured on military history or worked to develop exhibits at the Society of the Cincinnati, the Woodrow Wilson House, the Lafayette Society, and the National World War I Museum, and of course, the Army and Navy Club. I think this is your third presentation here. Thank you for that. Andrew has a BA from Brown University and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. And his work has been published in the Marine Corps Gazette and other professional publications. While not at work or studying military history, Andrew is an avid supporter of the Boy Scouts. So please give a hearty Army and Navy Club welcome to Andrew Wolfline.
Thank you, Miranda, for that introduction. And also I'd like to echo her welcome of them, especially of the Murphy family, his children and grandchildren who are here. So I'm delighted that you're able to make it. This evening, I'm going to cover quite a bit around John Cullen Murphy. He was prolific in his art production as well as his letters. So there's many different ways he could be interpreted. And this is my cut of him. And so I appreciate, your reactions too, and, your thoughts on this. So I'll go through the provenance of the material we have in the collection, give you a little introduction on him and his background, some of the themes in the letters that he wrote that were constant themes in many of the different letters, his experience as a soldier, and then how he made contributions with his art to the war effort. There's some of the letters that are specific to artwork, so we'll look at just a few of those art pieces that have letter references to them. And then I will just sort of towards the end, I wanted to show a lot of the images of the art from the South Pacific and as well as the occupation of Japan, and then we'll just conclude with his experience post-war. So in terms of the provenance, so this is an interesting art that we have at Brown because all of the art that we received as well as the letters were donated by the family in two different donations. So in 1994, the curator of the collection was working to put together an exhibit of the 50th anniversary of World War II, and he saw an article that was in American Heritage written by John Cullen Murphy's son, Cullen, about his father's experience in the war. And that started a correspondence. Our curator reached out to the Murphy family, and from that, they donated the artwork, and that was 91 sketches and watercolors that were in his different sketchbooks. He carried sketchbooks with him basically all the time. It was like an extension of his hand. And what was particularly good about the donation that as you know, I've been spending a lot of time with this material the past few months, it covered the entire war. So from 1941 through 1946, we could have just received, one period of that, but it covers the whole war. So that was really, fortuitous. And the second, so then basically 20 years fast forward, I met the youngest daughter of the Murphy family at an event in Connecticut. And from that discussion, we learned about the letters and we started a discussion with the family about the letters. And so they donated the letters to the collection. There's about 1,000 letters, and as well as photos. And so we digitally scanned the letters, and the family has a digital copy of the letters, and the collection also has a digital copy. And what's interesting too in these letters, and we'll look at it tonight, a lot of doodles. We could do an exhibit or a presentation just on the doodles in his letters. So honestly, we could. There's about 100, and this covers 41 to 46. What's important about the collection the Brown collection is a research collection. So scholars can use the collection to research. It's not like a lending library. And the combination of the letters and the art make this really important, I believe, primary source material for current and future generations of historians and academics and TV producers for documentaries, that sort of thing. So it's a great resource that will be, preserved for posterity. So that's a great place, I think, for the collection to, his art and letters to reside. the letters effectively form a diary. So Murphy wrote home at times every single day, and then other times, depending what he was doing, there might be little breaks, but every 2 or 3 days he was always writing a letter. And there were, as I said, there were periods where he was writing every single day. So it's effectively a diary. So our story with Murphy starts, John Cullen Murphy, he was born in 1919 in New York, moves to Chicago, and he goes back to New York to New Rochelle in 1930. And in 1934, he's playing baseball on a baseball diamond in New Rochelle, and Norman Rockwell sees him and asks him to pose as a model for a cover of the Saturday Evening Post. But from that interaction with Rockwell, Murphy had shown talent. He had already been doing art, so he had some talent, and Rockwell encouraged him. He served as sort of a mentor. They ended up corresponding during the war, and some of the letters are about his correspondence with Rockwell. He attended the Phoenix Art Institute, which today is the Pratt Institute, and then also the Art Student League, where Rockwell had studied as well. So this combination, this connection to Rockwell is an important sort of sub-theme, I guess I would say, in the collection and in the letters and in some of the art. So he joins in the end of 40, and he starts training in 1941. And so it's interesting, he's in the Army well before the war starts. And he spends about 2.5 years in the US, postings in Georgia, North Carolina, and then he goes to California, 42, 43, ships out to the Pacific in the middle of 43, and he's out there, and he's moving around. So, he's in Australia, New Guinea, and back and forth, and eventually in the Philippines, and then ultimately at the end of the war and into the post-occupation, he's in Japan. This is the insignia of the 7th Regiment that he was in New York, and there's just it's hard to see that, but little red dots of where he was in different parts of the theater. And so he's in, he has a very long, from 1941 through into 1946 in Japan. So he's in the military for quite a number of years. And one of the things I think that's, we forget about this today, but in 1940, the US military was about 450,000 troops, and 5 years later, it was over 12 million, a growth of 27 times. It was massive, massive growth. Today our military is about 2.2 million reserves and active, and if it was the same proportion as this, it would have 27 million in the Army today. 9% of the whole US population was in the Army based on the 1940 census. So, this huge growth in the military created opportunity for people who were in early to move fast through the ranks, because they needed all sorts of people. They needed everything. And he had talent and ambition and was intelligent and worked hard. So he, moved from 1941 as a buck private, and by 1945, in middle of 1945, he became a major. So, this is an interesting theme where he went from enlisted to officer, and so he worked his way through the ranks. Soldiers that came in a little bit later, it became harder to become an officer, because they didn't. The ones in front of them had sort of taken those positions, so there wasn't as much later in the war for enlisted to become officers. But for Murphy, he was in January, February 1941. He was in very early. And so, as I've been reading these letters, and I've been sort of absorbed with them for several months now, and as I see it, as I've read it, there's basically 6 themes that are in many of the letters. Now, any individual letter might talk about 1 or 2 or 3 of those themes, but broadly speaking, there are 6 themes. And so what this image is showing, these are some letterheads. When he was in the US, he was writing on any piece of paper he could get. So these are just some letterheads. But then once he went overseas, they had these things called V-mails. This is a V-mail. It was a 1-page paper, and it was about 7 by 9 inches, and you would write on it. The address was on there. There's no envelope. It's just the address was right there. And then they'd be filmed and then the microfilm would be shipped, so they didn't have to ship the actual paper, and it would reduce space on the ships. And it would also prevent any espionage, because microdots and things like that wouldn't carry over on the microfilming when they'd be reprinted on the other end. So they went both ways, from the US out to the troops and from the field into the home front. And so these 6 themes. So the first theme was what I call housekeeping. He talks a lot about what's happening with his mail. He's always talking about the mail and why I didn't get mail and why didn't it come, and then I got a lot of mail. So it's constant. And he was tracking how often his mother sent him letters. It's like, I didn't get one on September 3rd. So that's one sort of housekeeping thing. The second was money matters. I'm sending you a money order, or I constantly would be sending, referencing sort of money and money that he had earned from producing his art. The third sort of housekeeping theme was art supplies. He was always asking for paper, canvas, watercolors, at different points in time, he needed different things, but it was constant throughout the whole war. He needed different art supplies. So that was the first theme, housekeeping. The second was news. So he would talk about friends and family, what was going on with certain friends and family, especially his brothers, Bob and Tom, who were both in the service. Tom towards the end of the war. So where they are and what's happening with them, just the news of friends and family. The second, of course, around news would be just the war, what was happening with the war, the progress of the war. It was information that was publicly available. So it was after the fact. He wasn't revealing anything that was proprietary. And also the fate of some of their friends and people they knew had been killed or wounded or missing in action. There was some of that more in 44, later in the war, there's more of that. And then the third sort of news theme was just his own activities, things he was doing. So that's the second theme. The third theme was his art. So he was a trained artist before he had joined the military, and he was working on all sorts of different type of art throughout the war. And we're going to be looking at the images, so I'll just leave it there. But he was constantly sketching, painting, doing caricatures, all sorts of different art, and he'd refer to these in the letters. So those are the first 3 themes. The next theme, that's a huge theme, was sports. He was a sports fanatic, and he loved everything: college sports, professional sports, always asking about different teams and things going on. This is a picture of his softball team, and this is his commanding general that he worked for, Marquette, who had been the coach of the baseball team at West Point. So General Marquette took his softball very seriously. So the letters, he'd be saying, I got 2 hits and caught 3 fly balls, very detailed. And this is a professional tennis player who got recruited into the Army. So he saw him on the street, so he mentioned him. And one of the things I thought was interesting, Phil Rizzuto showed up at a baseball game. He's a Yankee Hall of Famer. He was playing in a softball game, but and he picked up squash while he was in Australia. So he was very active sports. And one of his humorous comments he made around sports is he wrote, "One of the greatest sports I've ever participated in is chasing jackrabbits in a Jeep. You really have to tear along and go cross country all the time." So this is in California in the Mojave Desert. So that was the fourth theme of sports. The fifth theme was sort of religion and his faith. He was a devout Catholic, and he was going to communion, mass regularly. And he would refer, I went to mass and communion all the time. And when he could, he'd go on a daily basis. But usually he would always report in on going to church. He'd read magazines and publications, religious publications, and he'd refer to those. So that was another theme that was very constant. And when he was in the Philippines, this is on a V-mail, he sketched these women who were in front of him in the pew in the church, and you can just see their piety and their devout praying. So that captured his eye. He really had an eye for anything. He could make art out of the most common thing, scenes that you could imagine. We'll look at some of those. And this is a church in the Philippines. So that's sort of a quick workup of a church in the Philippines. And the last sort of theme that my take on the themes was, his reading. He was an avid reader. Time magazine, the New Yorker, sports news, clippings that his mother would send him, but also books. And I would say, just from reading these letters, and this is my own opinion, I think he probably wrote more letters than any other soldier, enemy or allied. And he probably read more books than anyone else because he's constantly reading books. But what this is just an example. This is his Christmas list wish of books from 1941. And he said, he wrote, "I would rather receive a good book as a present than almost anything else." And this list of books, it really captures some of those themes I was talking about. He was interested in a book called The American Sporting Scene, The Place of G.K. Chesterton in Literature, The Secret History of the American Revolution, The Origins of the Jesuits, Philip II, and then a book on Gilbert and Sullivan. I mean, that captures in many respects a lot of his different interests in reading. This will be my last sort of touch on Norman Rockwell, but there was a correspondence when he was still in the States. And I'll let Murphy describe it. He said in this image here, you can see the similarity between Norman Rockwell's. This was a cover for the Saturday Evening Post, and this was an image that an idea that Murphy had been working on. He said, "Well, I was talking to Norman Rockwell yesterday. He sent me a telegram asking me to call him collect. So I did, and I got the story. Rockwell has a cover idea the same as mine, the one where he was carrying a package from home and was being pursued by a flock of hungry GIs. So, they had this commonality. And Murphy had done his own speculation, so he didn't have a contract to sell it, so he modified it, and Rockwell did end up printing his version here. So they were, and he referred to him as Norman. I mean, he's on the first name basis with him. He was very, close. And just one last one here. This was a series of paintings that Rockwell did around, and they were used to help raise war bonds and the different freedoms. So this is freedom of speech. And again, he describes this. I thought it was interesting. He writes, "How did you like Norman's freedom of speech? He changed the entire composition of that picture, and the shadow right here, the shadow, he said, and he changed the entire composition of that picture, and the shadow that I posed for isn't in it. When I left him last July, he was just beginning to draw it in charcoal, and he seemed satisfied with it. Then he must have changed the entire thing." So Murphy was going to be back here as a model, and he had modeled as a boy, as I mentioned earlier. So he was in there, and then in the final version, he was deleted. So there, and there wasn't a ton of Rockwell things. Maybe of these letters, there might have been 10 or so where he refers to him. And when he received a letter from Rockwell, he would send it home to his mother. Just one thing in the letter in terms of language. So this word "swell" was used, all the time. And it's sort of the equivalent today when we say great, he's great. But just examples, we have some really swell singers down here, swell columns, swell newspaper clippings, the swell food, swell historical novel. Monsignor Sheen's Easter Sunday talk was swell. The cookies you sent were swell. He's a swell guy. Bob had a swell time in Washington. My box lunch was swell. So it's really everything. And that was the word. So it just sort of really stuck out for me. And then, he signed off on the letter. So this is sort of interesting. All of these he used these different sign-off signatures. But it was interesting. So mostly when he was in the US in the first 2.5 years, he was using all these sort of funny little names. So for example, Jack 170 was his score for sharpshooter, and his brother got a 171. So he was a bit miffed about that. But he qualified. 170 was the qualifying level. So he signed a letter, Jack 170. When he got his private first class, he became One Stripe Jack. And just one last one, Jack, I'm beginning to be annoyed Murphy. He was put on guard duty when he was supposed to be painting, and sergeants coming back from leave or from being on leave put him on guard duty, and he was upset about that. But then once he went overseas, it was just this Jack, love Jack, all the letters. There is like once he got overseas, he stopped with all these little names. I don't know if it was he felt grown up or something, or more mature or something. I don't know, but he had all these little names in the beginning, the first couple of years. So he goes to basic training. He's at Camp Stewart in Georgia. A lot of KP, a lot of references to KP and guard duty in the beginning. But the thing I think is important to say about him is, he was a real soldier. He really, was the full. He wasn't just an artist who sort of pretended to be a soldier. He was a real soldier. He describes there's a lot of references to his training. I'll just give you one. He said, we had an infiltration course and you crawl for several hundred yards through trenches and barbed wire while 5 machine guns are firing 18 inches above your head and gas bombs are exploding all around you. It's really one of the toughest things I've ever done, and I was sore. So that, that's just one example, but he talks a lot about that. And the other thing, when he first gets there, and there's a constant, he's doing side jobs for portrait. He's painting enlisted men, he's painting officers. In every spare moment he has, he's got someone who's painting, because we'll get to his pictures. They're really nice, and people wanted to have their pictures done. And enlisted paid $1, officers paid $2. And then the more senior officers between $5 and $10. But in today's dollars, you basically multiply by 15, roughly. So he was making, good money on the side, especially as an enlisted man. He was making as much painting as he was on his salary. In the end of 41, he goes to a huge war games in North Carolina, Fort Bragg. And there's 500,000 American troops involved in this war games. He was on the Blue Army, which had 350,000, and they were fighting the Red Army. They had to take this bridge. This is a doodle from one of his letters, and just sort of a trooper there at that time hanging out. But they basically came up here, set up there. They had fake guns, wood guns, set them up, and just sort of were there for some time during these army training war games. So he talks a bit about that. Actually, one funny thing was he was there for several days, for weeks, and he was writing letters. And he left his unit and went up on a road and hailed down a car to take one of his letters to mail it. And the guy that took the letter was one of the judges. So, he's in war games and he's giving a letter to the judge, which he shouldn't have done, but the guy took it. It was a colonel. It was not a problem. And then 42, he gets into OCS, and it's for AA, for the anti-aircraft. And he talks about all the different classes he's taking. This is just an image of his of lectures to lectures to them. And in one of the letters, he draws this is a device they use to measure, altitude or something. It's called a transit. So he just gave a little diagram of it. But he took gunnery, 90mm gun, AA firing, orientation, all of these things, director, and theory of automatic weapons, height finder. And it was challenging. I mean, it was very hard work. And the most difficult one was a class called director. And director is sort of auto-targeting. The AA gun could auto-target targets in the sky. And he said it was very difficult. And he said, the way he passed these, he said, it's like all the other subjects I've taken up to now, 10% Murphy knowledge and 90% Hail Marys equals a passing grade. So he got through it. He did mention they had to do plane identification so they wouldn't shoot down their own planes. 50 planes were flashed up. They had 1/10 of a second. He got 47 correct. So he was very studious. This is just some of the photos of a battery, an AA battery that he took. And then when he's overseas, he's in New Guinea, but then he's there for some time, but then he goes back to Australia and he becomes the aide to General Marquette, who was the head of the anti-aircraft. And this is a doodle of General Marquette here, and then some other photos of General Marquette. He really had a lot of respect for General Marquette, really held him in high esteem. And so that was, this is a very important time for him. He became then initially he was like an informal aide, but then he became the formal aide. This is the aide on the right there is the aide's insignia that he would wear. But aides do a little bit of everything. And, he was the captain at the time initially. So his general had 2 aides, a major and a captain. He was the junior aide of those 2. And he describes a few of the things he had to do. One was, he wrote, I was instructed to take 2 visiting generals up to the old man's quarters, the old man being General Marquette, and see that they had plenty of beer. Well, cold beer is something that we low-ranking officers don't see very much of. So again, playing the perfect host, I did my duty. It's terribly hot here and a cold glass of beer goes very well. So he did things like that. There was another one, he had to arrange a dance and bring in 200 girls and get a bus and music. And the woman that were coordinating it, they had got the general to to get his aide to help set up this party. And they were just running him ragged to get this party set up. And he said, it's like, I'm wondering who is doing all the work anyway. So I help them out, but I work up a sweat in doing stuff. So it's doing all things like that. And they also traveled around quite a bit in the Pacific, going back and forth all to the different theaters. As I was reading the letters and looking at the art, this is the way I've sort of interpreted it, that there's sort of he made 5 contributions with his art to the war effort. And we're going to go through the 5 of them, but it's basically the portraiture painting he did, training material he did, communications, what I call morale, and then sort of the home front. And what's great about his art versus other military artists is, so this is not his art. This is a different artist in our collection. This is a guy named Harry Reeks, who's a Marine, who is embedded with a Marine unit. You can see this is just combat, right? This is pure combat. That sort of 1,000-yard stare. Reeks's work is very powerful. Murphy's is the exact opposite of that. And I think that it's great to have both, right? So Murphy's experience was not on the battle lines, but it was sort of behind the battle lines. And having both, I think, makes it a much richer interpretation of the overall experience in the war. So we'll look here now at what I think are his 5 contributions. The first is portrait art. And I think if you asked Murphy, he would say this was his biggest one, but I don't think maybe he gave himself enough credit for these other things that I think that he did. But portrait art, when he was in Brisbane, he was there for a number of months in mid-1944. He painted over 60 generals and colonels of the US, British, and Australian armies. And he would describe, so these are workup sketches. And what he says, my system is this: the person sits for me while I draw a rather finished sketch of them in pencil. This usually takes a half hour. Then I make notes of the coloring, ribbons, etc. Then the model is all through. I trace this pencil drawing onto my watercolor board and paint it using the notes. The actual painting is done without the model. I'm beginning to get very familiar with watercolors, and this will do me a lot of good when I get back to civilian life. So these are just a couple of the American generals that he did the sketches of. So these we have in the collection. So he'd take these sketches, and then he would do a more detailed portrait. And this is of the Australian Field Marshal Blamey. He was the Supreme Commander of Australian Forces. And so what would happen, he would do these portraits, and the generals liked them so much they ended up taking the first one and typically sending them home to their wives as gifts. So he had to do them a second time. And there was a conference room in Brisbane where sort of the headquarters command center, and in maybe a room about this size, I would guess, maybe. But he would put the second round of portraits would be were in that room, so all the generals could see themselves, I guess. But so he did that, that was what he did with the second round of portraits. And he describes it, he told his mother, he said, I've painted portraits of a man in every rank from private through major general. That's quite a record, I think. And the generals, they were very appreciative of his art. And this is just a thank you note that he transcribed to a letter he sent home to his mother. But I'm going to read one from General Eichelberger, who was the commander of the 8th Army. He had major combat experience and a lot of victories. He said, "Dear Captain Murphy, I just want you to know that the watercolor which you made of me some time ago arrived in safety in Asheville, North Carolina. Mrs. Eichelberg has told me in her letters that she is delighted with it and regards it as being a priceless possession. I thought you might like to have a report on this and to know how much it pleased her. I have never seen her so happy over a gift as she has been over that one." So they really appreciated what he did for them. And so the couple of the most senior guys, he would do watercolors and oil portraits. That was the very top guys. And Eichelberger got an oil portrait too. But he visited them later, and they were at a lunch. And after the lunch, Eichelberger took him into a little pantry, and he describes this. He hauled out a bottle of Johnny Walker Red Label Scotch and gave it to me. He said that it wasn't intended as a payment for the pictures or anything of the kind, because the pictures had far greater value to him than that. Just a little gift from him to me. And other officers also gave him booze like that. He didn't drink the booze, but he used it to trade for other things. He used it as currency. And of course, he did MacArthur portrait. We don't have the final version of this. I know the family has some, and this is a doodle in his letter of the MacArthur portrait that he did there. And apparently, he heard through the grapevine that General MacArthur said that it was the best painting he had ever seen done of himself. This painting was reproduced in the Chicago Tribune, and Murphy was paid for that. And you know, as he was reflecting on all this portrait painting, he realized, and this is sort of how he was thinking about it, he said, you know, most of my career in the Army has been on the gravy train. However, I've gotten so I don't fight it anymore because the fact remains that people love to have their pictures painted. And no matter what I do, they always find me out. Of course, I have not been limited to that. I have acted as a real aid to the old man besides turning out a lot of this great artwork. So, you know, he was thinking about what he was doing, but he realized, you know, people really liked the artwork in addition to MacArthur. So when he did MacArthur, that portrait was done through a photo. But then he did MacArthur's wife and son, Arthur, and they did pose for him. And this is just a sketch of the boy here. And then again, this is a doodle in the letters. You can see the V-mail there. And he goes on to describe this one of Mrs. MacArthur. He says, well, I finished the Mrs. MacArthur's portrait and it really looks swell. So late this afternoon, the general and I, General Marquette, walked over to her place and delivered the painting. She was very pleased, really was. And of course, that made me quite happy. Mrs. MacArthur was her usual charming self. And in several of the letters, General Marquette and Murphy and Mrs. MacArthur have sherry. They have glasses of sherry together. He said, if I ever write a book, I can certainly fill it up with a lot of chapters with some interesting Army experiences. And Marquette was sort of the coordinator for all these books. He would arrange for him to do the different paintings with different generals. And this is just a scene of a historical scene of MacArthur turning over power in the Philippines, civil power. And so this one, he was at this event. This is sort of a historic event. He didn't sketch it, but he took photos, and from his photos, he came up. This is sort of a work in progress, like a rough draft of the ceremony handing over the power. So that's the first theme, and that was sort of the longest one because I think he spent so much time on that on the portrait painting. But the second is sort of an interesting piece of history. I didn't really know a lot about this Benny the Bungler, but so Benny the Bungler was a character created by Murphy. It was really a sort of Rosie the Riveter for the military. And Benny the Bungler was sort of a bungler who would mess stuff up. And because, you know, the millions of people joining the military, they tried to train guys what they needed to do to be a good soldier, what they called America's alertment, not this sort of, you know, slacker, Benny the Bungler. And this is just in one of his letters home to his mother, the picture of Benny the Bungler. So there's a series of these posters that would be put in the barracks and things like that. And the troops could see them in the barracks. This is Benny the Bungler, who's had, this is right around Thanksgiving, so he's had too much turkey for Thanksgiving. Again, these are in the letters, but just showing you some of the posters. And here's Benny the Bungler, you know, wondering why this guy's doing so well. And one other one, just how to deliver a message. And then, you know, here he's drawn Benny the Bungler with all his Christmas gifts, thanking folks for the Christmas gifts. So that was another thing, training. So, you know, training soldiers how to you know, be a good soldier. And this is one of my favorites. This was just a little sketch he put in one of the letters. And it's Benny the Bungler talking with MacArthur here, saying, you know, I think we ought to strike through Guinea, Doug. You know, you can see that there's MacArthur there. And that was just sort of randomly in there, but he definitely had a sense of humor. I mean, you know, he's a caricaturist. The third one is what I call communication. So he used, he did something called a news map. News maps were circulated to the troops on a weekly basis to tell them the progress of the war. There were maps, there were things like that. And he illustrated one of the news maps with what the AA was doing in terms of the war effort. So I don't have the one that he did, but this is just an example. And another thing, just an example around communications, he was asked to redesign their patch for overseas AA troops. And they came up with where there were going to be a bunch of white stars here. But he went through 16 design iterations on the patch. He also illustrated a series of posters on Japanese atrocities. So these sorts of things, you know, sort of public knowledge, you know, news communication was another contribution of his art. Another one was caricature. When I think I look at it as morale boosting. You know, the troops are out there for years and years. They're away from home. I mean, the USO would go and do shows, Bob Hope and those guys going, but the troops did their own entertainment too. And just to give you an example, these are some caricatures he drew, and he's describing a party. They called it a chalk show, and he said he put on a chalk show last Saturday night that was quite a success. We must have had about 100 officers there. I did 8 caricatures picked from the audience, and they really turned out okay. And everyone seemed to get some good belly laughs out of it. At the conclusion, I was given a big hand. While I worked on a picture, about 3 minutes for each, we had a piano playing in the background. So you can sort of imagine that party with all those guys and having to laugh. So I think it was, you know, he was boosting morale. He did it for other enlisted parties. He did pictures of sergeants, same thing. He painted murals in the recreation hall. He painted an officers club with scenes of guys drinking and having a good time. So, you know, a lot of that I think is just, you know, creating a positive morale for the troops. And then the last theme, as I sort of see it, was what I call the home front. So he was using art that he was sending back to the States to create, you know, to get that art in the US, awareness of what was going on. But he describes these WWIIs, the Women's Army Corps. He said, and I'll read what he said. He said, I've thought of an idea for some sketches that might go over pretty well. Call it Girls in Guinea, or Should WWIIs Wear Slacks? I'm going to work up several sketches of the WWIIs in New Guinea, things that I have observed in my travels that should make interesting sketches. And this is one where the GI is saying, funny, GIs are always willing to give a WWII a hitchhike ride, you know. So another one, he said, so I have finished those WWII drawings and they look swell. They look swell. Everyone gets a laugh out of them, for they are sort of cartoony. I hope to do 3 more, then send to the States. They are done in a very loose style, watercolor and pen and ink over it. I like that style very much. And you can see the tear here from the books they're in. And that's another thing too, you know, these books were about that big. They weren't huge. I mean, to make that much detailed artwork in these small sketchbooks is impressive. Just a couple more of the WWIIs. He said, just further on this story, he said he met Don Starr of the Chicago Tribune in Manila. He said to send some of my watercolors, as they run a lot of color stuff in their Sunday supplements. He thinks they would be very much interested in some of the sketches, and they pay well too. So he did get them, you know, the Chicago Tribune was one that did run a bunch of his work. And then the other comment I'll make about this was his mother in the letters. She was sort of a agent, if you will, like a mini agent. He was constantly asking her to, you know, go and meet these different groups, Ladies Home Journal, Collier's, to try to get the art published. And also, in addition to this series of the WWIIs, he would do some speculation, cover art for publications, Look, Liberty, Columbia, Life used some of his pictures. So he was trying to get that work in the home front. So I wanted to just share 3 images. So this one is not in our collection. It's with the Murphy family. This is a self-portrait, and it's quite big. It's, I don't know, about 2.5 feet by 3.5 feet. It's a very big portrait. And when you find something in a reference in the letter to specific art, it always sort of resonates. And there's just 3 that I wanted to share, but this I thought was very interesting. He said, I did watercolor, of course, in less than a day. And that's something too. He's a very quick, efficient artist. He was not taking forever to do things. He could do art very quickly. But he said, I did this watercolor in less than a day, propped up a mirror on a chair, drew myself in pencil, and then painted it. First of all, just going to do a head and bust. But I had so much paper left, and I was so fascinated by the trench coat that I decided to make myself a glamorous looking figure. And then he said about his hand there, that's his right hand. But he said, he wrote about the right hand, it's actually my left hand, for don't you see, I was looking in a mirror. So he was painting like that, and he was painting his left hand. So that's a little sidebar note. So this is in New Guinea, and he describes this. I thought you can just imagine this as he was writing it. He said, it was one Sunday afternoon when there wasn't anything in particular to be done. So I decided to take my sketch paraphernalia and go for a hike in the jungle. I followed a stream that went up into the mountains, passing several small native huts. I drew several of these and proceeded up the stream, soon coming in sight of a mother, father, and child. She was cutting up coconuts and cooking them in some way. You have a painting that I made of her cutting open a coconut with a machete. So that's example. That's where the letter ties directly to the art. And one last one is an interior of a plane. So this is the sketch. We don't have the final version that he painted, but this is a detailed sketch that he did. And he said, last night I spent the evening on a watercolor I began a long time ago in Brisbane. The subject is a group of soldiers all jumbled together in one of the big air transports, a scene I know well, as do most of the personnel in this theater. I finished the watercolor of the interior of the C-47 with all the GIs sprawled all around, and it looks pretty good. So you can see that, yeah, you can see the detail of the guys there. I'm at the point in this presentation, I'm just going to show a bunch of art relatively quickly now to give you a sense of his campaign in the South Pacific and in Japan, and make a few comments on them. So on the ships, they would see these boxers, and he could just paint anything, pen and ink, and then he would put the color in later. This is a pencil sketch of sailors playing cards, really detailed pencil sketch. And this is another one of a woman gorilla in the Philippines. And I mentioned about primary source material. I thought this is what I was thinking about this. If 200 years from now someone says there were no women fighting a guerrilla war in World War II in the Philippines, well, this would show that there were, that sort of thing. So this just something that captivated him. And this is guys lining up for the mess chat, the chow line on a ship, watercolor with pen and ink. This is a convoy going out to New Guinea. And this is what he called the thinker, just a soldier on a boat thinking about life, having a cigarette. And then, this gunner's mate Snyder, a couple of him. And he gets to Australia. And of course, this is actually the only one of a kangaroo, but it's Australia, there's going to be a kangaroo. And that, again, is in just a doodle in one of his letters. He meets the Australians, and he's really awed by the Australians. And there's a funny thing. He said, the Americans challenged the Australians to cricket. Of course, I'll be playing in the game. I figured that any good ball player ought to be able to play a sissy game like cricket. And then the next day, after the game was over, he writes, yesterday we had our cricket match with the Australians. Of course, we lost 117-41. So he also he liked their hats, and he said he wanted to bring one home. He said they call everything as bloody to them, and they're a really rugged bunch of blokes. So he really, enjoyed the Australians. This is General Blamey. So I put the formal portrait that you saw earlier up here, but this is a caricature of him. This is a couple weeks after the war was over. So he was kicking back, and he said, speaking of the Aussies, I saw General Blamey in Manila several times. He is round, roly-poly sort of a guy, and is very much beribboned. He's a full general and is head of the all Aussie military force. So he's making a little bit of fun there. And yeah. And then he painted natives. Again, I thought it was interesting, both the doodle and the letter, as well as the sort of worked up artwork. You can see it's basically almost identical. These are more of the natives. This guy here on the right, he said he's killed 100 Japs. So that's, sort of interesting. And then this is a laborer. When he was writing about this, he said, that watercolors of New Guinea natives could be painted directly from life in about 10 minutes. So he's very quick. That took maybe 10 minutes to do, that sort of type of picture. So he's a very efficient artist in that way. So there was one interesting, I guess you would call it an iconic letter. And it's a little bit long, but I think it's worth hearing. It's on December 24th, 1944 in the Philippines. And he comes out of church and he hears carols after mass, and he wrote, and this is actually, he typed this up. You can see it's, and that's the other thing, single space. He was very, very efficient in the use of space. But he said, we investigated and found a very sizable group of soldiers and Filipino civilians gathered around a group of very pretty little Filipino girls who were singing. Each of these girls was holding a candle, and it made a wonderful effect. They were all gathered around in front of General MacArthur's abode and were singing carols to him. I looked up on the porch and there he was, hands on his hips, face immobile, not moving a muscle. He must have stood there for over an hour listening to the music. It was a truly magnificent subject. Several times the singing was interrupted by alerts, and that made it all the more interesting. At the conclusion of the caroling, General MacArthur leaned over the railing and said, "Thank you very much. I wish you a very Merry Christmas. May God bless you all." Then he turned on his heel and exited. Truly a memorable performance. And here's the payoff. Right after the singing, Hirohito decided to send a couple of his emissaries over to wish us Christmas greetings. And with a magnificent display of pyrotechnics, our AA boys brought them down to the cheers of the crowd. So it's very dramatic. And actually he asked his mother to try to get that published back in the States, you know, in certain, actually in some of the Catholic publications. So he asked her to do that. But I thought that was, you know, a very sort of dramatic letter. So the war ends, and I'll show some pictures of when he gets to Japan in October of 45, and he's there into the spring of 46. These are just some sketches of Japanese soldiers that he's seen, and some civilians and soldiers. And this is MacArthur's sitting room, and he would draw a picture where, you know, he'd draw this detailed pencil picture and then put here, you know, this is certain colors and things, so he could go back and paint a watercolor later, knowing what the colors were. This is the room that Hirohito met MacArthur in, and he's got the notes here. Hirohito sat here, MacArthur sat here, and again, he's got the different colors and things in the room. So these very detailed pencil sketches. And then he did some things in the countryside as well. And of course, if you're in Japan, you're going to do Mount Fuji. And again, I love it as this is a doodle from a letter, and this is the artwork. It's sort of hard to see the mountain there, but it is there. And then I'm just going to finish up with sort of what happened to him after the war, just very summary comments. So he gets a Bronze Star for his meritorious service. He gets married in 51 to Joan Byrne. They have 8 children, several of which are here tonight. He becomes a illustrator of this comic strip called Big Ben Bolt. And it's about a boxer, sort of about a boxer. And in the 50s, boxing was very popular and is nationally syndicated cartoon. And then he gets involved with Prince Valiant, initially sort of, you know, stepping in for Hal Farser, and then he takes it over, and he does that for almost 35 years. And he wins, he's a 6-time winner of the National Cartoonist Society's Story Comic Strip Award. He won it in 1971, 74, 76, 78, 84, and 1987, the most ever awarded to a cartoonist. So Prince Valiant was, you know, very central to his work. So that is it. I hope that you sort of a whirlwind covering a lot, but I hope that you enjoyed that.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to start with a question for you from the webinar. Do you have any idea where General MacArthur's son is today?
General MacArthur's son. So I had read something that he was living in Greenwich Village and he had changed his name because it's so much notoriety. He changed his name so he'd be a little more incognito, but that was some time ago. But as far as I know, he was living in Greenwich Village in New York.
Do we have any from our audience here in the room?
I'm Catherine. So my question is, the pick that he used to send all these letters home, did he originally use that as a doodle pad and then repurpose it for a letter? Or had he planned to write the letter in addition to the doodle at the same time?
No, so the question is, did he write the letters and then do the doodles later, or plan the letters and add the doodles later, basically? So no, I think he did. I think he just put them in the letters. For example, this one here. this one here is great. It's like, you can't really see that there, but he says, I don't have any news today. There's no news. There's nothing I can tell you. But so then he put this guy in here, which is this incredibly detailed pen and ink drawing. I just think he put things that I think he would do doodles like we would write words. So I think just if he wanted to illustrate something, I mean, that like that example of the war games, it was just a simple little diagram, that sort of thing. So I don't think he worried too much or did too much planning around the doodles. They just sort of, they came, you know, naturally to him, depending on what he was writing about.
I have one. As you were going through these letters, did you kind of notice any like trends or development, anything that really kind of changed from the earliest to the later letters?
No, so yeah, no, I think that he, those 6 themes, it was right from the beginning to the end, those sorts of themes. He had a few political observations, a few, but yeah, so maybe a little bit of that, but for the most part, he stuck to a lot of themes. He was covering a lot of material in those 6 themes I outlined. So yeah, they didn't really change too much over the period.
I think we have time for one more.
Probably isn't a very good one for the last one, but do you have any sense of how often his mother? This was Carol Murphy, who's so Carol's father was Tom.
Tom, okay, Tom, yeah.
Never wrote home to mother.
Yeah. So, yeah, one thing about Tom. So Tom joined the war later. He was in high school and he came into the Army in like 40 years. He got in the Air Force and he flew 7 missions over Japan. So he, in just the last couple months of the war. I'm sorry.
Do you have any sense of how often his mother?
Oh, yeah. So yes, because, you know, John Cullen Murphy basically kept a grid chart of the dates he would get letters. I mean, he would be like, you know, I got September 3rd and September 5th. What happened to September 4th? You know, so he kept a pretty detailed account of what he was getting from his mother. There'd be delays in the mail and then he'd get a ton of letters. And he was, I mean, he would usually start his letters with the status of the mail. And yeah, so we don't have her letters. I don't know, maybe he discarded them. I don't know what he did with them, but we just have his letters home to her. And he asked her to save the letters. You know, he wanted that record. But yeah, we don't, yeah, he knew, but, you know, very detailed. But, and when you read these letters one after the other, you can, it's almost like some conversation, things happening and different topics would be covered from one letter to the next, to the next. So you could sort of imagine what the mother was writing about, because he was answering those questions and then asking about other people, and then he'd respond back in another letter about that. So you get a sense for what she was corresponding. Good.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Anyone who would like to, dinner is downstairs. So you should probably still be able to get a table there. And
Good.
thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you all very much. Really appreciate your attention and interest.